Hello and welcome to Occupied Thoughts, a podcast brought to you by the Foundation for Middle East Peace. I'm Lara Friedman and I'm the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. Today is July 15th, 2021, and it is my pleasure to have with me today Iyad El-Baghdadi. Iyad is an internationally recognized Arab Spring activist, an expert on authoritarianism. He's also the president of Kawakibi Foundation, which is kawakibi.org. The tagline is awesome. The tagline is, "Our work causes headaches and sleepless nights for tyrants and terrorists." He is also the editor-in-chief of the Arab Tyrant Manual, an independent online publishing platform focused on freedom, human rights, and the fight against all forms of authoritarianism globally. Iyad comes to us today as a stateless Palestinian, born in Kuwait, raised in the UAE, and now living as a political refugee in Norway. And we're going to be talking about a lot of things related to that. You can follow Iyad on Twitter at Iyad_El-Baghdadi, or check out his website, which includes links to his other work at elbaghdadi.com. And I will say, I've been following Iyad and his fearless, indefatigable work fighting against authoritarianism and fighting for freedom and rights pretty much for the past decade, starting with the Arab Spring. And I am honored and really delighted to have him here with me today. So Iyad, welcome to Occupied Thoughts, and thank you for joining me today. Can you start off by introducing yourselves to our listeners, some of whom may have made the mistake of not following you on Twitter all of this time?
This is always the most difficult question to introduce myself. But briefly, I mean, you gave a good intro. I was, born and raised in the Gulf, in the Arab world, for the first third of my life, I had a very typical, upper middle class upbringing in the United Arab Emirates. My father was a doctor. My father himself, his family were expelled from Jaffa in 1948. He was a baby. He grew up in Egypt. My mother's family is also Palestinian, also from Jaffa, but when, after the Nakba, they had left towards Syria, but eventually settled in Kuwait, where she was, she was raised. And so the family basically, my parents got married and moved to the United Arab Emirates, and it was a new country at the time. This was 1970s. My initial career was in startups. I'm a computer programmer by education, but very quickly went into starting up startups, starting new things, and I really didn't have much of a political bent until 2011 with the start of the Arab Spring uprisings, when I felt this enormous sense of responsibility, that almost a personal sense of responsibility, saying that this is it. We need to make our voices heard, and if we sit this one out, then we won't be able to face our own children later, saying that such a historical moment came and went and we just did nothing. And yeah, that's when I believe you must have started following me, Egyptian Uprising. I became influential online very, very soon, which is dangerous if you're living in a country such as the United Arab Emirates, which does not really tolerate any kind of political activism or dissent. In fact, I received my first warning the day after Mubarak was ousted. Kind of the message really was, don't speak about Bahrain, because Bahrain was very close to the UAE, and also don't speak about Palestine because we don't want you importing other issues into the Emirati context, which is of course very difficult to do when you're Palestinian yourself. But yeah, in 2014, they kind of had enough with my activism, and this was also a time when the global the balance had shifted, the pendulum had shifted to the other side, and the counter-revolutionary axis, which was basically led by the United Arab Emirates, had the upper hand. And so they felt empowered enough to take certain actions. I ended up in prison and then expelled from the country. I had to live in an airport for a while because I had literally nowhere to go as a stateless person. Um, and eventually I was invited to Norway to speak at the Human Rights Conference. This was in 2014, and I applied for asylum shortly afterwards. And continued my activism here. And of course, I think I was in the news frequently after that because in 2016, ISIS put me on a hit list. And that was, they gave me another warning in 2017. That was my first contact with Norwegian intelligence to basically had to tell them that this is something that happened. But then in 2017 itself, I started to become closer to the Saudi context, mainly because of Mohammed bin Salman, and there's a whole story about that my literary agent really wants me to write. But in 2018, I became close to Jamal Khashoggi, who he was kind of transitioning from being someone who was kind of a regime figure to becoming more of an activist figure, even though he did not like the term, but he absolutely was doing activism. And we were talking about certain projects, and he was killed too soon, when we're still talking about what projects we could launch. And shortly after that, I received a warning that the Saudis also have their eyes on me. And it was in 2019 that Norwegian intelligence agents basically knocked on my door and said that we need to talk to you. And they said basically that the CIA gave them a warning that I was also a target. So I've been under protection in Norway since then. Of course, I've managed to use the time to write a book and start a foundation. So I think it wasn't too bad.
You've been enormously productive throughout all of this. I think that's something for people that are not familiar with your work. Throughout all of these travails, you never ceased speaking out and working. It's been quite extraordinary to watch and quite humbling, actually. The reason that I so badly wanted to have you on the podcast right now was to really get your thoughts on some things related to the Palestine situation, which you do talk about, you do tweet about and write about. And specifically, I want to start off just really zooming in on what's happening on the ground in Palestine today. And I'm curious for your thoughts about the current Palestinian political deadlock and the rising grassroots demands for change. And this is as someone who's been, you were a key voice during the Arab Spring, as we are seeing this in other countries. And what is your view about what is happening and what it would mean for there to be a new way forward? What would that look like? How could it emerge?
Well, I mean, in my perspective, the political deadlock really is a long way coming. I mean, we could see it coming, and I think both sides, whether it is the Palestinian Authority or Hamas, honestly, I feel like this deadlock has been analyzed to death. And I feel like every time I read another thread or another article or another podcast about it, I feel like, why are we still talking about this? We've analyzed this to death. We should move on to solutions. The ways, really, the two ways, and the need for a third way, the ways really were theories of change, visions for the future. And the two current ways have already reached their conclusion. They've reached their stasis. This is the best that they can come up with. There's no horizon beyond this. There's no vision, and there's no. I mean, it seems that they've kind of they would like to say that they have a solution or a way forward, but they obviously don't.
When you say the two ways, what do you mean?
I mean the diplomatic path, which is of course embraced by the PA, but also by many world powers, including the EU, including the United States. They keep yammering about it as if there is such a thing as a peace process, and I think many of them really don't understand how hurtful it is to keep talking about something that doesn't really exist. It's almost like, do you think we're stupid? I mean, do you think that either that you are you don't respect our intelligence, or you actually believe in a fantasy. There is no peace process, and in fact, even within Israel itself, it's not like the majority of Israelis, I believe, according to polls, do not support a two-state solution. In fact, I think in the Knesset, it's a minority position as well. So, I mean, of course, this is the one path, which is the PA, and this is why, of course, this is the PA's deadlock. On the other path, which is Hamas, Hamas, of course, is kind of stuck where it is, in a sense that it's it had to survive under these difficult years under Trump, where it was, of course, threatened with extermination. But then Hamas, I mean, the thing about Hamas is they really don't have a vision beyond their own survival as a movement. In other words, and this is something which I wish more Palestinians would understand, Hamas is not acting as a resistance movement, but rather as an Arab regime, as another government, which is motivated by self-preservation, which can be populist when it wants to, which can appear to be reasonable or rational when it wants to, but eventually it does not have a vision. It does not have a vision, and it doesn't really have a plan beyond its own survival, its own acceptance, which is why we see that this was abundantly clear in its moves during the last war, when it was clear that it's trying to align itself with the Iranian axis, anticipating some kind of regional bargain, which it might benefit it. But also you saw that it's opening up to Sisi, for example, opening up to Egypt, to the Egyptian regime, to different. It really, and I even went into certain clubhouse events when Khaled Mishal, for example, was speaking, because I wanted to get closer to how they're thinking, and it was clear to me that they wanted to end their isolation. They wanted to leverage their position, this prestige, this resistance, the prestige that comes with resistance. In not only, of course, among the Palestinians, but in the Arab world, towards ending their isolation. But again, for this exact reason, they're not really thinking strategically about the struggle itself. They're not thinking strategically about how to re-legitimize themselves. And they're not really thinking rationally about the future. I mean, they're really driven by survival. And they can't really lead. I mean, a partisan movement cannot lead a national struggle, and this is abundantly clear. So this is, I mean, for us to talk about the emergence of the third way, since the two ways are really theaters of change, resistance, armed resistance versus diplomacy. I think two things have to happen. There are two tracks. The first is that someone has to present a vision. I mean, someone has to actually present something, a strategic vision that works. And in order to do that, we have to look very far into the future, because in the short term, there's not going to be a solution. This is something we need to cope with. I feel like in many cases, because we're not willing to simply say this cannot be solved right now, we kind of assume that if it cannot be solved right now, that means it cannot be solved, or it should not be solved, or we should not think far ahead. I've kind of, I mean, my notes are kind of full of notes about a 20-year plan. And this is, I think this is something I mentioned to you earlier. I think that we can win in 20 years. We cannot win in 10 years. We cannot win in 5 years. But if we think in terms of 20 years, then there's a lot that we can do, and there's a lot that's actually going in our direction.
So let me ask.
But like I said, there's two things that have to happen. The first is someone has to present a vision. The second is that someone has to organize a movement. And organizing a movement here, I feel that, I've been involved in many projects to organize movements in other contexts, and people consult me on the Saudi context, or the Bahraini context, or the Egyptian context, etc. And I always feel that people try to jump over the steps. They want to go directly to political organizing, or to starting a political party or something like that. And I think that's a mistake. I think, especially in the Palestinian context, which is a fractured context, Palestinians have been separated from each other for a very long time, and this is why the events earlier this year were very inspiring for Palestinians, because we kind of reclaimed an inter-Palestinian or a cross-Palestinian solidarity, which is again, I mean, it was a beautiful thing to see. But I'm reminded by kind of, this is kind of a story when I was in prison in the United Arab Emirates, and I was they had to deport me, they had to expel me, and I had nowhere to go. So I ended up in a cell where the people who cannot be expelled anywhere are kept. There are orders to expel them, so they cannot be released from prison, but also there's nowhere to send them to. And at that time, it was all Palestinians and some Syrians. This was in 2014. And I remember sitting there with all of these different Palestinians and noticing something very, very basic, which is that we don't even share the same dialect. So there's the Lebanese Palestinian who speaks Lebanese. There's me. I grew up in both of my parents are from Jaffa, so I speak Palestinian Arabic. But there's also the guy who speaks Egyptian Palestinian, Egyptian with an Egyptian dialect because his family spent more time in Egypt. And there are those who have a Khaliji, like a Gulf accent, because they were they grew up more around depends where they grew up. And I realized that we have been atomized. I mean, even the diaspora itself, we say diaspora, but it's actually multiple diasporas. But then, it's a well-known story now, because people in the West Bank have their own, their own reality, their own lived reality. People in Jerusalem, of course, are at the intersection of something very ugly. There's the Palestinian citizens of Israel. And of course, there's the people in Gaza, and then there's the multiple diasporas. I mean, we can't really speak of just one diaspora. When you force people into parallel lived conditions, they end up having different mentalities, different ways of thinking, because you're forcing them to contend with different problems. The first thing that we have to do, if we have to organize a movement, is to reestablish social connections. I believe the first thing that we need to do is simply get to know each other, get to talking to each other, get to know each other. I mean, as someone who does a lot of social media organizing, I mean, I've been doing this for a decade. I've been, in various groups. I feel not enough of this happens. Not enough of simply texting someone and saying, "Hey, let's have a conversation. Let's just get to know each other. Even if we don't agree, let's just get to know each other." So I think that's the first thing that we have to do, and then we start to speak about, once you have people getting to know each other more, they will naturally start to organize, naturally start to collaborate on things. Okay, I'm doing this podcast, for example. Would you like to come on the podcast? Or I have this campaign. Would you like to join the campaign? And then, I think this is the basis, and then from there we can kind of create a kind of an association or a congress or something like that, and then we speak about, creating a political movement. So that's the thing. If we have to think this way, we have to think in terms of 2 to 5 years, rather than let's do something now.
So let me ask you. There's so many things I want to dig in more deeply on this. So the first thing I'm thinking, when I think about you talk about the community, Palestinians being atomized. Thinking just for the peace process era, it strikes me that is a feature, not a bug, of the peace process era, right? Which reduced the Palestinian issue. Palestinian legitimacy, the legitimacy of Palestinian leadership, was based on essentially cutting off all the other diasporas and saying this is just about the West Bank and Gaza, and in effect delegitimizing those voices. And it's interesting, we are reaching, it seems, a point where that, as the peace process era ends, or is recognized that it's ended, that no longer applies, and it's exciting seeing what we saw again in May with across the Green Line and across the world. It does strike me, and you said that you have different outlooks and different the different contexts, because different Palestinians are dealing with different challenges. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on how you align that longer term outlook for change, for a third way, with the reality on the ground for Palestinians living under occupation, right? You have the dual for those living under Palestinian Authority, whether or not the Green Line is still meaningful, regardless, you still have continual, oppression, dispossession, taking of land, demolition of homes, all of that. I wrote something back in the Arab Spring era with Khaled al-Gindi, sort of musing on why you don't have the same Arab Spring that you in Palestine that you had in the rest of the region, looking at the fact that you basically have double authoritarian rules, and it's not so easy how to figure out how to challenge either or both simultaneously. So I'd be really curious for your thoughts there.
No, it's also that, I mean, if you compare it to the people in Gaza, for example, which is under siege and under a lot of pressure, it's more difficult to resist Hamas because it kind of feels like betrayal, because it feels like, we're already under pressure. We're all under pressure. I mean, it's a human thing that when a community is under pressure, they band together more. And I think, ironically enough, Jewish people can know this more than anyone else, given their history. But then the thing about the Arab Spring, what made the Arab Spring possible is this idea that all of these dictators for a very long time have said that the West is your enemy, or Israel is your enemy, or Iran is your enemy, or some external factor is your enemy, or colonialism or imperialism, etc. And all of these are, there's a kernel of truth in all of that, but doesn't exactly mean that you're my friend. What happened in the Arab Spring is that so many people across the Arab region pointed the finger back at their own regimes, back at their own dictator, and said, no, you are the enemy. You are the enemy. You are enemy number one. This is more difficult when, like you said, when you have multiple layers of oppression, where you don't know where to point the finger. I feel that this is breaking when in the case of the PA, mainly because it is dawning on everybody, including the PA themselves, that they don't have a vision and they don't have a future, and there's no horizon there. And so, under what pretext are you ruling us? Under what pretext are you beating us up and punching us in the face? Under what kind of legitimacy do you have anyway? When you control like 18% of the West Bank anyway, and you have no chance of getting beyond that. So you have your choices either to accept being a Bantustan, which is currently what you are, or you have to relinquish legitimacy somehow. The thing is, like you mentioned, and I think I have a more nuanced take on the PA itself and its future, because I think any place where Palestinians have self-rule should be preserved. In other words, any experiment in Palestinian self-rule should not be something to be dismantled. But what's happening with the PA particularly is that they no longer deserve to represent Palestinian legitimacy, and they absolutely do not represent the whole body politic of 13 million Palestinians in the world. And the point about the diaspora, of course, is valid. The diaspora, we're talking about 8 to 9 million people who are very well resourced, very well educated. You enter. I mean, I remember a friend of mine back in the UAE making this observation, saying that whenever I enter a big company, anywhere in the Gulf, somewhere near the top, there's a Palestinian. So this is a highly educated, highly resourced population. And I think it's by design that they need to be sidelined, because if you actually engage them, if they're part of the struggle completely, all in, then the balance of power is going to be different. And I think we've seen this in these events, because the war of narratives, a lot of the heavy lifting really was done by Palestinian influencers.
Sorry, I forgot I was muted. I want to come back to you on the war of narratives. That's where we're going to end, because I think that's in some ways the most fascinating and quickly moving thing. I want to ask you to talk about the interregional element, right? Again, it's a feature, not a bug, that Palestinians in many ways in the West Bank and Gaza are cut off from the region. That's a feature, not a bug, of this political framework in which they exist. The Arab Spring swept through the region and inspired across borders. What do you see as the interregional element on a Palestinian third way, or a shifting of the paradigm? And also, speaking to you as someone who has lived in the Gulf, the normalization trends that are now in play between Israel and Gulf states, do those figure into it all? Are those countervailing forces that have to be contended with, or can those potentially actually be somehow constructive or at least not negative?
Yeah, I mean, I would say these are two different questions. So I'll start with the first one. The Israelis know that even though they stand tall over the Palestinians, you're talking about 6.5 million Israeli Jews in the vicinity of 450 million Arabs. Palestine is not a 60-40 issue or a 50-50 issue in the Arab world. I think in the latest polls, there was a poll right before COVID, and I think it was something in the upper 80%, 88% or something of Arabs consider Palestine to be one of the most important, if not the most important, cause for them. In fact, I mean, I think in the same year people were asked about their religiosity, like whether they practice religion. And I think that did not crack 88%. So it is not a matter of. I mean, this is not something which you can say is disputed among the Arab masses. The Palestinian cause also has tremendous mobilization potential. We've seen this recently, and of course, because of this reason, because it has this ability to unite, people who would otherwise not be united, it attracts people who would like to manipulate it. There's every dictator in the region, every populist movement or extremist movement in the region has tried to appeal to the Palestinian cause, but it's not because this is because it has this power, this innate power. I think a lot of the problem with the current Palestinian leadership is really a lack of vision, a lack of ambition, not realizing that the Palestinian cause really sits at the intersection of multiple, systems of oppression. It's not just about what Israel is doing, but it's really about as Israel was only allowed to do this for the longest time because of unconditional Western support. And many people don't realize that this has actually deeply affected and almost like really demolished the Israeli left, because if the Israeli right wing can get whatever it wants, the Israeli body politic, the voters do not really have to think very hard because there's no cost to what they do to the Palestinians, and as a result, the people who would argue, the Israelis that would argue that we would like to have peaceful coexistence, we would like to have justice, they're in the minority right now. It's a movement in crisis. So when we come back to the interregional element, it is very clear to me as a Palestinian. It was clear to me even in 2011 that nothing will happen unless the regional balance of power tips in our favor. This can only happen when this large, intergenerational, interregional transition to democracy is completed. This is not something, of course, these kind of transitions do not happen in a few weeks. I mean, I remember it was July of 2011, I think, that the BBC invited me to attend a panel about the failure of the Arab Spring, July 2011, okay? They were already talking about the failure of the Arab Spring in July of 2011 because they thought that this is something that's supposed to take weeks, when it takes a generation. It's something that takes 20, 30 years. I recently wrote a book with my partner, Ahmed, and we're talking about the Arab Spring as a 30-year process, and we're 10 years into a 30-year process. So this is the importance of the interregional element, or you have the pieces there, which is that Palestine has tremendous mobilization potential. It is a very powerful cause because of its moral. It has innate moral power, which is both an asset and a liability sometimes. But also there is a strategic need for the region to rise up in order for us to have a solution, an interregional solution here, interregional peace. Your second question was about normalization between certain key Arab regimes, the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, and of course, Bahrain basically its foreign policy is almost run from Riyadh. So the fact that they actually would take such a step must have come from Riyadh, from the Saudis. And we've seen that extend to Sudan and to Morocco. And I think I want to talk specifically about the Gulf monarchies, because you could see that the peace, the treaties between them and the Israelis are different from what happened, for example, with Egypt or with Jordan, because it's a warm peace. It's not a cold peace. The UAE, I mean, I lived in the UAE, for most of my life. I was 37 years old when I was expelled. The UAE is a very small country by population, by native population. It's home to 10 million people, but only 1 million of them are actually citizens. It has a very weird political economy because, it's a country where 90% of people, of the population, of the permanent population, long-term population, are not even citizens. These demographics are getting worse. By 2050, I think it's going to be less than 5%. So it's going to be 95% non-citizens to 5% citizens. Even the birth rates among citizens are low. This is a country that, for whatever reasons, around 2011 and 2012, decided to take a very aggressive foreign policy. A country of 1 million picked up a fight with Iran, which has 82 million people, Turkey, which also has 82 million people, and tried to influence the internal machinations of the Saudi royal family. Saudi Arabia is almost 30 million people, and of course Egypt, which is 100 million people. When you're a small country in a vicinity of giants, you don't want the giants to get up. The giants must always be broken. And guess who can agree with that? The Bahrainis, a very tiny country, and also the Israelis. So there is a certain strategic sense there, because if you are that player, I mean, this is the game to play if you are that player. And I guess the whole point. Of course, there's a whole conversation to be had about there's a certain aspect of the Palestinian struggle, which really concerns the minority-majority dynamic within the Middle East and North Africa. This is a region where multiple peoples have always lived. We have always coexisted. But then we have not coexisted as equals. Someone had to stand on someone's neck, and really we have to redefine our national movement to be something which is beyond simply talking about decolonizing or liberating Palestine or achieving Palestinian self-determination. I think we need to understand that Palestine sits in the intersection of multiple global, systems of oppression. You have like I mentioned, the minority-majority dynamic, as in who gets, I mean, is it going to be safe to be a minority in this region? Does the minority always have to appeal to either a foreign power or to a local dictator to keep it safe? There's also, of course, global white supremacy or Western supremacy, which actually enabled the situation for a very long time, because these are the same people who enable Arab dictators, and these are also the same people who have for a very long time enabled Israeli actions. And then, of course, you have the situation in Palestine itself, the apartheid. So these are three layers, and I think that we have to understand that if you have to lead the Palestinian people, you also have to be a leader in these three things. You have to be an Arab Spring leader. You have to be a global social justice leader. You can't only be a Palestinian leader, because we don't have the luxury to simply focus on Palestine. Because unfortunately, we're in a situation where we need to fix the entire region and the entire world in order to have dignity. It's not an enviable position to be in. But sometimes the impossible is inspiring.
What you're saying about Palestine sitting at the intersection of these global and historical trends strikes me as extremely insightful. I'm probably going to give that as the title for this podcast. It's really powerful. I want to ask you one more question. We're running out of time. I want you to talk about the war of narratives, and this is a war that you've been directly and powerfully engaged in. And I want you to talk about how that figures into the current Palestinian struggle, the move towards a third way, this wave, this long-term effort, and also what it would look like to win this. What would it mean to win the war of narratives?
So I think when we talk about narratives, I think many people misunderstand the importance and power, or misplace the importance or power of narratives. I think most political decisions, especially in a post-social media world, political decisions happen within a ruling narrative, a mainstream narrative. Sometimes I feel like the narrative is almost like the river, the direction and speed and the flow of the river. And then you're forced to actually contend with it, whether or not whatever direction you want to swim in, you have to contend with the fact that this is the narrative, this is the way the winds are blowing right now. So I feel that the theory of change that really we talk about mostly in our team is that you have to win the narrative first and then win the policy. And sometimes if you win the narrative, then the policy is going to take care of itself. We've seen that, for example, the most practical example is really Mohammed bin Salman. Mohammed bin Salman was presented to the region as an alternative. He was to be a model, to be replicated across the region. And this was his danger. I mean, it's nothing personal against him that I decided to commit myself directly to the Saudi theater of the Arab Spring. It just happened that he was being presented as the solution, as someone who's going to be replicated. There's going to be Mohammed bin Salman's everywhere. So we had to make sure that that he fails where he is, because it was clear that maybe we're assisted by the fact that he himself is not forgive me to say that, but he's an idiot. And it's easy to, it's basically, he's someone who made it very clear that he's kind of like almost a cartoon villain. So it's clear that a lot of what he wanted to do cannot really be done anymore. But he's going to keep trying because there's nobody to say no to him. There's nobody to. Unfortunately, he puts himself in a position where he's married into power. But yeah, I don't want to digress from there. But the whole idea here is that he came up with a certain narrative, and he was assisted. By the way, it's true that the Israelis give him hacking technology that he used against many people, including myself. But they also give him. I'm fairly sure that he's also a client to some Israeli consultants on the matter of narratives as well. The point here is that he lost the narrative, and he lost the narrative because for a while he had the narrative. I mean, remember March of 2018 when he came to the United States and he was treated as a liberator, as a reformer, and he was going to change, he was going to reform us Arabs because we're so savage and wicked and backwards. So this is the guy who's going to bring us to the 21st century. And influencers, he met with Bill Gates, he met with Oprah, he met with of course with Jeff Bezos, etc. He was treated as as a hero. He had the narrative, and then he lost it. At the moment he lost it, you see that the policy is catching up. And you see, for example, that during the Democratic primaries, everybody was, kind of competing about who's going to be tougher towards him. And of course, this is an ongoing process, but this is what happens when you lose the narrative. When you lose the narrative, eventually you also lose the policy. This is the importance of the narrative. Power is married into narrative now. You have to win the narrative in order to win the policy. And again, in the case of Palestine, this is the significance of what happened. This is the really big significance of what happened earlier this year. We absolutely did win the narrative. Our voices were louder, and our message was more consistent, and it was simpler. It was simply, we're not really here to convince people about specific political arrangements or this peace plan or that peace plan. We're simply saying we're human beings, and as human beings, we deserve human rights. That's it. I mean, you don't have to understand much about the history of the region or the history of the conflict or the complexities of this region. All you have to know is that we're human beings and we deserve to be treated with dignity. That's all. It's a very simple message. Now, where are we going to take this narrative? I mean, what is the future of this narrative? That's another question, because that has to, I mean, we have to evolve this towards something bigger, because it has to be connected to a long-term vision. And this is, I think, where a lot of my time is going right now.
Well, I would love to have you back, maybe on a panel with some other Palestinians from other places, including from who are living in Palestine, to dig into that deeper. I think it's really it's a rich vein. And I would add the shift in narrative, or the shift in language, to a rights-based language, which Palestinians have been doing for a long time, but I think belatedly, much of the international community, the pundits have increasingly adopted themselves, is hugely significant. It really does shift the way people understand the issue. And as you say, it's much simpler than people, than some people would want it to be. We do have to end here. I am so grateful for your time. Thank you so much for joining us, Iyad. This has been really fascinating. I want to thank our listeners. Thanks for listening. And don't forget, you can follow Iyad on Twitter at Iyad _El-Baghdadi, or check him out at elbaghdadi.com. And finally, I want to remind everyone, subscribe to the podcast. You can do so on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Spotify. That way you won't miss any of the great content we're posting pretty much every week. And you can also listen to it and watch the video from our podcasts on our website at www.fmep.org. And with that, we're going to end it. I'm Lara Friedman, president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace, signing off. Thank you, Iyad El-Baghdadi. And until the next episode of Occupied Thoughts, thank you all.